Hello, everyone. Welcome back to episode number 8 of this Raspberry Pi Pico tutorial series on object-oriented design. In this episode, we're going to be talking about buttons. Now, the reason why we have an entire video just on buttons is because conceptually, these buttons are a little different from objects that we have seen so far. Now, you have seen objects like the light strip, you have seen objects like light, you have seen buzzer. In all these cases, what we have been doing is we have been creating an instance of the class that represent the object, and then we call methods for that object to do something. For example, you can take this RGB LED light and you can create an instance of the RGB LED and then ask it to show a color, and it does that. You can take an LED, ask it to turn on, and it does that. So in every case, you're basically, after you create an instance, you call a method and it does something. So you're actually sending an output to a device. Buttons don't quite work that way because buttons, again, you create an instance of the button, but then you don't send something to the button for it to do something. You wait for somebody, that is the user, to do something with the buttons for you to do something in response, right? So in the difference is that in these cases, for the light strips, they were output devices, whereas buttons are input devices. Okay. So remember that when we started the series, we called these pins GPIO pin. We have been using the O part of it, which is the output. Today, we're going to see how we take inputs from devices. Now, you can get inputs from other devices like sensors, keypads, joysticks, and we will get to those as we go forward. But today, we start with the most basic of input devices, and we'll see how we incorporate buttons in our applications. Let's get started. So first, let's talk a little conceptual, right? Um, as I told you before, that our buttons are input devices, right? So we have to use them in a slightly different way. Okay. So this is kind of the conceptual model, the class model of our button process. I'll tell you a little bit about how it works. But basically, you have your own class, and we have talked about creating our own classes. So here is your own class. So I called it your own class, right? Today, we're going to keep things kind of conceptual. So here is a class that you have created. Let's call it your own class. You've got your own attributes in it and your own method to it. Suppose you want this class to receive events from one or more buttons, right? So I have created an association, one-to-many association. My class can receive inputs or events from multiple buttons. And let's take a look at the button class. The button class has its own internal attributes like pin, name, which is pretty typical for most of the classes that you will see in the Pico library. But it's got other things like last status, low active. That's something important, whether you want the button to go 0 when it's active or 1. Regardless, it's not all that important. But what is important is this handler guy. Okay. So there are different programming languages that work differently for things like this. So in Java, for example, there's something called listeners. In Swift, they're called delegates. In Python and some other languages, often you'll hear the word called handler. Now, typically what happens is there is in object-oriented design, there is a concept called interface or protocol. So in Java, it's called interface. In or abstract classes. In Swift, it's called protocol. So it's basically a set of methods that somebody, like in this case, whoever designed this button class, or me in this case, I am asking you to remember that there is, in order to use a button, you have to implement a handler. And the handler is basically just a set of two methods, button pressed and button released. In this case, button handler, right? Now, in Python, There is no concept of interfaces or abstract classes. The newer versions of Python are incorporating abstract classes, but typically you will not see that. So we're going to talk more about typing in Python as we go forward, but Python is kind of a loosely typed language. So we don't have to create a special class or an abstract class or an interface called button handler. But what you do need to remember is that any class that needs to receive inputs from a button needs to implement these two methods, button pressed and button released. Exactly that way. Button pressed with a single parameter called name and button release with a single parameter called name. Why is that? Because that's the way I designed the button. So if you want to handle events from my button class, these are the two that you will need to implement. Okay, so anytime, so for example, if you have a programming language like Java or JavaScript, where you are receiving inputs from the user, for example, a mouse click, you are going to have listeners like on click, on release, on hover, things like that, right? So those are the events that the mouse class is sending back to the class that's listening to it. So that's the way it works. Today we're going to keep it pretty simple. I'm going to tell you that my button class requires you to implement these two methods, button pressed and button release. There is no special button handler class because Python doesn't really support abstract classes or interfaces. So what you do is you just create your own class and you add these two methods to it, button pressed and button release. Now, why is that name parameter in there? Well, this is because you may connect to multiple buttons, right? So all the buttons, when they're pressed or released, they're sending back calls to the handler, in this case, your own class, button press, button press, button press, right? And depending on which button is pressed, it's going to send back a different parameter. So you can use that parameter to figure out which button was pressed and do whatever it is that you will need to do for that class. So that's essentially how it works. Let's take a quick look at another type of diagram that we have not quite seen so far, but we will be seeing it, called sequence diagram. So let's take a look at how a sequence diagram works. And here is a sequence diagram for how the button works. This is a new thing that we're doing here. So there's an actor, which is a user in this case. Your class, what it's doing, as usual, when it comes alive, it's going to send init messages to buttons. So in this case, let's say it's got two buttons. It's going to send an init message to a button. Button gets created, sends another init message to the button. Button gets created. What is important to note is that there is a handler parameter in init. You can also, in the button class, there is also something called set handler. So you can change the handler if you want to change to a different handler, for example. But in the init class, you can say handler equals self. Self is the Python term for this own class. So I want this class, your own class, to handle button presses. So you're basically going to send self to the handler parameter so that when the button gets any pushes, it's going to send back the button pressed method calls to self, in which case, this case, it was the instance of your own class. So there you go. You send two init methods to the two buttons. And now the actor comes and pushes one of the buttons. That button is going to send back a call to button pressed to the handler. And you do whatever it is you need to do over here when you get that call. Same thing when the user releases the button, the handler, the button is going to send back a button released method to the class. So that's how it works. Let's see this in action, and then we will look at the code. So I've got four buttons in this setup. This is actually a slightly different kit. You might have seen it in some of my other videos. This is from a different manufacturer called LaughVin, not the Freenov kit today, but it's another kit that's available from Amazon, pretty cheap. But so we have four buttons here. One is white, red, yellow, and blue, right? Let's watch what happens when I push the white button. Notice that the white LED turns on in my light strip. I release it and the white LED turns off. Then red, same thing, yellow, and blue. Right? I can actually press multiple ones. Right? Yeah, hard to press all four at the same time, but basically you get the idea. I push the buttons and they come on, and I can push multiple buttons and they do their own things. Right? So that's basically how this class works. Super simple. Let's see how this works on the simulator. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the code on the simulators. So first, what we will do is we'll take one of our old projects and create a copy of it for this video. And as usual, I'll share the link to this simulation in the description below. So this was our old project. We don't need this code anymore, and we do not need these LEDs. Instead, we're going to add some buttons to this. So what I typically like to do is I go to plus and push button is right there. And what I'm going to do is do two things. First, I'm going to turn off the bounce. My button class does have a debouncing option. For those of you who do not know what debouncing is, look it up. All spring-loaded buttons, instead of just going between 1 and 0, they sort of bounce around between 0 and 1 for a little bit before stabilizing. So debouncing is an important part of handling button calls, but that's all in the code. But the simulator bounce simulation is a little strange, so my code doesn't work too well with it. Anyway, so what I like to also do is rotate this so that the pins are pointing down. That's a little easier to connect. And we've got four buttons in this thing. We're going to try to make the simulation look as close to this as possible. So we will have a white, a red, a yellow, and a blue. So let me just copy this and paste it 3 times. So I have four buttons. Let's scroll down a little bit so we can see them better. So here are our four buttons, and I'm going to color them the same way, white. In the simulator, the simplest thing to do would be to create a ground ground bus and connect. From the ground bus, you go to each one of the pins of each of the buttons. And the other pin, we connect to the IO pin that it goes to. Okay, so let's take a look at how this code works. In your own class, there is our own class here, and it's got an init in which I'm basically creating the four instances of the four buttons. Notice that I'm giving them names: white, red, yellow, and blue, depending on what color of button they are. And then I'm also creating a light strip. Let's turn on the brightness to full brightness, because in the simulation, the brightness, half brightness looks a little weird. And then our own method is just a dummy method, just keeps the program running, not doing anything specific. But here are the handler methods. By the way, you should notice that the four instances of buttons, they're all created with handler equals self. So we are telling the buttons that send all of the handler messages to me, my own class, because I have the button pressed and button released methods that I can handle. Notice that the button pressed and button released, they get the name as a parameter, so you can use it to figure out which button was pressed. So if the white button was pressed, it'll come back with the name white. So we can set the pixel 0 to white. For red, we set pixel 1 to red. For yellow, we set it to 2 to yellow and so forth. So that's basically how this code works. Really simple. Of course, we will need to upload the button class. So let's do that. Here's the button.py from Pico library. So now we can run it and see how this works. All right, so now we've got the 4 buttons constructed and the NeoPixel constructed. Let's push one of the buttons and notice that I get white light on and red, yellow, blue, yellow. But that's basically how it works. So as you can see exactly how the code worked on the hardware, this is the simulated version of the code. And the concept is super simple. All you have to do is implement button pressed and button released, and that's all you need. Hope this was fun, useful. Now you can add a button to your project. Let's keep learning, and I will see you in the next video.